Close your eyes for a moment. Can you hear it? That unmistakable opening chord. The screams. The pure electricity of youth and possibility. For those of us who were there, who lived through it, the memories are as vivid as yesterday. February 7th, 1964. Four young men with unusual haircuts stepped off a plane at Kennedy Airport, and America would never be the same. But even if you weren't there, even if you're discovering them now, you know the Beatles. Their music is woven into the fabric of our lives, passed down through generations like a precious heirloom. And today, we're going to remember why that is. This isn't just a story about a band, it's a story about us. About a moment in time when music truly had the power to heal a wounded nation and bring joy back into our hearts. To understand what the Beatles meant to America, you have to remember where we were. It was late 1963. President Kennedy had been assassinated just 10 weeks earlier. The nation was in mourning. We were shocked, grieving, uncertain. The television showed us the funeral procession over and over. The world felt darker, heavier. We needed something, anything, to remind us that joy still existed. And then, almost like destiny, came four working-class lads from Liverpool, England. John Lennon, the witty, sharp-tongued leader with those distinctive round glasses. Paul McCartney, the charming one with that face and that voice. George Harrison, the quiet, spiritual guitarist who would blossom into a master. And Ringo Starr, lovable, funny, the drummer who kept the beat and won everyone's heart. They weren't born into privilege. Liverpool in the 1940s and 50s was a rough port city, still recovering from World War II bombing. These boys grew up in modest homes, went to ordinary schools, and probably shouldn't have amounted to much by the standards of the British class system. But they had something else. They had each other. They had guitars. And they had an unquenchable hunger to make music. The story of their early years is now legendary. The dingy clubs of Hamburg, Germany, where they played 8-hour sets and learned their craft. The Cavern Club in Liverpool, where they performed nearly 300 times in a basement that smelled of sweat and beer. Their manager, Brian Epstein, who believed in them when they were just another local band. George Martin, the producer who heard something special and became the fifth Beatle. They worked. Lord, did they work. While other bands were content to copy American rock and roll, the Beatles were absorbing it, transforming it, making it their own. Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Buddy Holly, the Motown sound. They loved it all and learned from it all. By 1963, they'd conquered Britain. Please, please me. She loves you. I want to hold your hand. The songs were everywhere. Girls screamed. Boys grew their hair longer. Parents worried. But America? America was different. We'd invented rock and roll. We had Elvis. We weren't sure we needed four British boys telling us how to rock. Capitol Records in America had even rejected them at first. Can you imagine? The greatest band of all time, and someone said, no thanks. But then something shifted. A disc jockey in Washington, D.C. played I Want to Hold Your Hand in December 1963. The phone lines lit up. Kids loved it. Other stations started playing it. And suddenly, impossibly, the Beatles had the #1 song in America before they'd even set foot in the country. February 7th, 1964. If you were there, you remember where you were. If you weren't, your parents or grandparents probably told you about it. The Beatles landed at Kennedy Airport to meet thousands of screaming fans. The scenes were unprecedented. 3,000 teenagers somehow found out they were coming. Police couldn't control the crowds. It was chaos. Beautiful, joyful chaos. I want you to think about what that must have felt like. Just months after the darkest moment in recent American history, here was something to celebrate. something to scream about with pure, unbridled joy. The Beatles didn't just bring music, they brought hope. Documentary director David Tedeschi captured this intense 2-week period in unprecedented detail, and what we see is remarkable. These weren't arrogant superstars. They were four working-class boys, barely in their 20s, completely overwhelmed and trying to make sense of what was happening to them. They checked into the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan, and immediately they were prisoners of their own success. Fans surrounded the building. They couldn't leave. They couldn't walk outside. So they did what they always did. They hung out together, playing music, cracking jokes, being themselves. George Harrison later recalled, "The Beatles were they actually were funny. Everybody in Liverpool thinks they're a comedian." That Liverpool humor, that working-class wit, shone through in every interview. American reporters kept asking them serious questions about their hair, their music, what they meant. And the Beatles would respond with jokes, with charm, with that refusal to take themselves too seriously. If you weren't there, it's hard to explain what Sunday Night on Ed Sullivan meant to families in 1964. It wasn't like today where entertainment is everywhere, on every device. There were 3 TV networks. Sullivan's show was one of the only places where the whole family gathered to watch together. Ed Sullivan had introduced America to Elvis, to so many stars. That night, 73 million people tuned in, the most watched television event of its time. Think about that number. 73 million, nearly half of America. Families gathered around black and white television sets in living rooms from New York to California. Parents who weren't sure about this British invasion. Teenagers who'd been waiting, breathless, for this moment. Younger kids wondering what all the fuss was about. And then the Beatles appeared. Paul counted them in, and they launched into their opening number. The camera cut to the audience, and what we saw was unlike anything America had experienced. Girls weren't just clapping. They were crying, screaming. Some looked like they might faint. The emotion was real and raw and infectious. The Beatles performed 5 songs that night, and when it was over, America was different. Let me tell you what happened. The next day, juvenile crime reports in New York City dropped, not by a little, dramatically. Kids weren't on the streets causing trouble. They were home, talking about the Beatles, trying to play guitar, growing their hair out. That's the power of hope. That's what happens when you give young people something positive to care about. The Beatles stayed in America for 2 more weeks. They performed their first American concert at the Washington Coliseum in Washington, D.C., playing on a rotating stage so all sides of the arena could see them. Then Carnegie Hall in New York, 2 shows in one night. Another appearance on Ed Sullivan, this time live from Miami. And through it all, they remained remarkably themselves. Professional, yes. Hard-working, absolutely. But also funny, kind, and seemingly amazed by everything that was happening to them. Consider the context of their arrival. President Kennedy had been assassinated just 10 weeks prior. The country was still in a state of shock. But the Beatles, perhaps without even fully understanding it, gave America permission to smile again, to feel young, to believe in tomorrow. But here's what we need to talk about, and this is important. The Beatles weren't just a cultural phenomenon. They were musicians, real musicians. And their music evolved and grew in ways that no one could have predicted. Those early songs, the ones that conquered America in 1964, they were perfect pop music. Catchy, melodic, irresistible. You couldn't help but sing along. The harmonies were tight. The energy was explosive. They made you want to dance, to clap, to be alive. But the Beatles didn't rest on success. They couldn't. They were artists, and artists need to grow. By 1965 and 1966, their music was becoming more sophisticated. The album Rubber Soul showed they could write about deeper emotions, more complex relationships. Revolver experimented with studio techniques that had never been tried before. They were pushing boundaries, taking risks. And then came 1967, The Summer of Love, and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. If you bought that album when it came out, you opened that gatefold cover with all those faces on it, famous people, cultural icons, all crowded together. You saw the Beatles in their colorful uniforms. And then you put the record on, and it wasn't like anything you'd heard before. It was ambitious, experimental. It was rock and roll mixed with orchestra, with Indian music, with sounds from the circus and sounds from dreams. It was Paul singing about being 64, a song that maybe means more now than it did then. It was John singing about a girl in the sky with diamonds, about newspaper taxis and kaleidoscope eyes. Some people thought they'd gone too far. Others thought they'd just begun. The truth is, the Beatles were showing us that popular music could be art. It could be meaningful. It could challenge you while it entertained you. The late 60s were turbulent times: Vietnam, civil rights struggles, protests, uncertainty. And through it all, the Beatles kept giving us music that reflected what we were feeling. They went to India to study meditation. They fell in love, got married, had children. They grew up in public, and we grew up with them. The Beatles' music was a unique blend of rock, pop, and R&B, and they never forgot their roots or the black artists who influenced them. They covered songs by Chuck Berry, Little Richard, the Isley Brothers, and always gave credit where credit was due. The White Album in 1968 was sprawling, diverse, experimental, almost like 4 solo albums in one. Abbey Road in 1969 was a gorgeous swan song, especially that side 2 medley where the songs flowed into each other like a suite. Every album was an event. Every single was analyzed and discussed. They were the soundtrack to our lives, whether we were teenagers in the 60s, young adults starting families, or older folks watching our world change. By 1970, it was over. The Beatles had grown apart, pursued different interests, developed different artistic visions. The partnership that had created so much magic couldn't hold together the weight of fame, business pressures, and simply growing up. When Paul McCartney announced he was leaving the Beatles in April 1970, it felt like the end of an era. Because it was. If you were young when they broke up, you remember the feeling. It was like losing friends. These 4 men who'd been part of your life for years, whose faces you knew as well as your own family, whose voices had sung you through first loves and heartbreaks and everything in between, they weren't going to make music together anymore. It hurt. It really did. But here's what we learned. The music didn't end. It couldn't end. John, Paul, George, and Ringo all went on to make wonderful solo music. John gave us Imagine and Mind Games. Paul formed Wings and continued to write beautiful melodies. George finally got to shine with All Things Must Pass and My Sweet Lord. Ringo had hits and brought joy wherever he went. They each found their own paths, and that's okay. That's life. Sometimes the best thing people can do is grow in different directions while cherishing what they built together. In December 1980, John Lennon was murdered outside his apartment in New York City. The world stopped. We grieved again, this time for a man who'd given us so much joy, so much music, so much hope. He was only 40 years old. It wasn't fair. It isn't fair. And then, in November 2001, George Harrison lost his battle with cancer. The quiet Beatle, the spiritual one, was gone too. Only 58 years old. But Paul and Ringo carry on. They're in their 80s now, still making music, still performing. They provided new interviews for the recent documentary Beatles 64, sharing memories, still honoring what they built together all those years ago. So let me ask you something. Why does this band, a band that broke up over 50 years ago, still matter? Why are we still talking about them? Why do their songs still play on the radio? Why do young people who weren't even born when John and George died still discover the Beatles and fall in love? I'll tell you why. Because the Beatles understood something fundamental about being human. They understood joy. They understood heartbreak. They understood friendship and creativity and the power of working together towards something bigger than yourself. Their early songs were about love, simple, pure, uncomplicated love, holding hands, wanting to be with someone, feeling that first flush of romance. Who doesn't remember that feeling? Who doesn't want to remember it? Their later songs were about growth, about searching for meaning, about questioning and wondering and trying to figure out this complicated world we live in. They were about meditation and peace and coming together. They were about continuing on when things get hard, about carrying weight on your shoulders but doing it together. The Beatles were four individuals who became something greater than the sum of their parts. They showed us that magic happens when talented people collaborate, when they challenge each other, when they refuse to settle for good enough. And here's what really matters. The Beatles were kind. Despite all the fame, all the pressure, all the chaos, they remained fundamentally decent people. They used their platform to advocate for peace. They spoke out against war. They embraced different cultures and different musical traditions. They were curious about the world. They made mistakes, sure. They were human. But they tried. They cared. And their music reflected values we can all aspire to: love, peace, joy, creativity, friendship. For those of us who lived through Beatlemania, who were there when they first appeared on Ed Sullivan, who bought the albums as they came out, these memories are precious. They're part of our youth, our identity, our story. We remember where we were. We remember how it felt. We remember the excitement of a new Beatles album, the discussions with friends about which song was best, the posters on our walls, the arguments about whether Paul or John was the better songwriter. Trick question, they were both brilliant. We remember growing our hair longer, despite what our parents said. We remember the fashion, the optimism, the sense that maybe, just maybe, love really could be all you need. And for younger people discovering the Beatles now, there's a different kind of magic. There's the joy of finding something timeless, something that transcends generations. There's the realization that great art doesn't age, it just becomes more valuable. The Beatles' influence on music is incalculable. Every rock band, every pop group, every singer-songwriter for the past 60 years has been influenced by them, whether they acknowledge it or not. They showed us that rock and roll could be sophisticated without losing its soul. They proved that commercial success and artistic integrity weren't mutually exclusive. They demonstrated that musicians could write their own songs, produce their own records, and have creative control over their work. Before the Beatles, most pop singers just performed songs written by professional songwriters. After the Beatles, musicians were expected to write their own material. They changed the entire industry. They pioneered music videos before MTV existed. They experimented with studio techniques that are now standard. They showed that an album could be a cohesive work of art, not just a collection of singles. But beyond all the technical achievements, beyond the sales figures and the records broken and the influence on other artists, the Beatles gave us something simpler and more profound. They gave us joy. In a world that can be difficult and painful and confusing, they gave us music that makes us feel good, music that makes us want to sing, music that connects us to other people, across generations, across cultures, across everything that might divide us. As recently as November 2024, a new documentary called Beatles 64 was released, featuring never-before-seen footage of the band and reminding us all why they mattered then and why they matter now. The footage, restored in 4K with sound remixed by Giles Martin, George Martin's son, brings that magical moment in 1964 back to life with stunning clarity. It's like stepping into a time machine. And people are watching. Not just those of us who remember, but young people too. Because great art transcends time. Because these songs, these faces, this story, it's part of our shared human experience now. So what are we really talking about when we talk about the Beatles? We're talking about four young men who dared to dream big, who worked harder than anyone, who stayed friends even when it was hard, who made music that changed the world. We're talking about a moment in time when anything seemed possible, when youth and energy and creativity combined to create something magical. We're talking about the power of music to heal, to unite, to inspire. We're talking about love, not just romantic love, but love for your friends, love for your craft, love for life itself. If you were there, you know. You carry those memories with you. They're part of who you are. And that's beautiful. Hold on to them. Share them. Tell your children and grandchildren what it was like. Help them understand what the Beatles meant. If you weren't there, if you're just discovering them now, welcome. You're in for a treat. Start with the early albums and work your way forward. Watch the journey. See how they grew. Listen to the music evolve. But most importantly, just listen. Listen to the melodies. Listen to the harmonies. Listen to the joy and the sadness and the hope and the humanity in every song. The Beatles aren't just a band from the past. They're a reminder of what we can be at our best. They're proof that music matters, that art matters, that creativity and collaboration and refusing to settle for mediocrity can change the world. John once said that before Elvis, there was nothing. But before the Beatles, there were many things. After the Beatles, everything was different. They didn't just make music. They showed us that music could change everything. And 60 years later, the music plays on. The joy continues. The legacy endures. Thank you, John. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, George. Thank you, Ringo. Thank you for the music. Thank you for the memories. Thank you for showing us that love really can be all we need.